Good morning, everybody. As chair of the board of trustees of the Fritt Ord Foundation, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this international conference on Russia under Putin, together with our partners, the New York Review of Books and Koltaru, one of the leading Russian language websites for coverage of politics and culture. Our conference is bringing together scholars, journalists, writers, and poets from Russia, Europe, and the United States. We find ourselves meeting at a time of deepening uncertainty and ambiguity in relations between Russia and the West. And we think this is the right moment to hold a conference which would examine a series of aspects of Putin's Russia, the structure of the regime, the sources of its power, and how these are maintained. This conference brings together, it brings the testimony of journalists, writers, lawyers, and activists who are working or have been working in Russia. They have experienced at first hand the impact of the regime's policies on human rights, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. And they may have, in their professional lives, chronicled, criticized, and opposed these practices. The program should give us a rich overview of several pressing issues for all of us. For the ones with special interest in Russia, the Putin regime, or East-West relations, or as generally concerned citizens in today's climate, marked by increasing tensions. The program should give us knowledge and insights as to the ecology of these tensions. A few words on the organizers. The Fritt Ord Freedom of Expression Foundation is a private Norwegian organization whose overarching objective is to promote this freedom and stimulate public debate in Norway. And in special cases, Fritt Ord also seeks to advance freedom of expression in other countries. For example, together with the Zeitstiftung in Germany, Fritt Ord organizes the Free Media Awards yearly, press prizes to support independent journalists and media in Russia and Eastern Europe. And in collaboration with the Thomson Reuters Foundation in the UK and the Robert Bosch Stiftung in Germany, we have established the project Perspektivi to strengthen journalism in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. This is to advance regional expertise on underreported issues and to contribute to mutual international understanding. Our foundation has had the pleasure of collaborating with the New York Review of Books as co-organizer and co-sponsor of several major international conferences in New York, Oxford, Paris, Berlin, Hong Kong, and Oslo over the past years. Our collaboration began with the event Weather Report, What Can We Do? About global warming, the Copenhagen climate talks, and policy options for the future. Oslo has been the venue for 3 such conferences: the hope for humanism within the West, beyond the West, challenges to multiculturalism in a global context, and technology and the human future. It has been a privilege for us to draw up the program for this conference, together with both New York Review and Koltaru, partners with a far-reaching interest and independent publishing, humanism, and human rights. It is now the pleasure for me to give the floor to Simon Head, Director of Programs for the New York Review of Books Foundation, before Maria Stepanova, poet and essayist and the founder and editor-in-chief of the journal Koltaru. A warm welcome to everybody. Enjoy.
Thank you, Grete, for those remarks. I want to join her in celebrating our partnership between the New York Review of Books Foundation and Fritt Ord, which I think has now existed for almost 10 years and has covered the wide range of subjects which Grete mentioned, humanism, populism, technology, the Middle East, China, and now Russia. And it's in that context that I also welcome and celebrate Culture.ru as a partner. It's the first time we've had a Russian partner for our conferences, and it's extremely timely that we should do this now at a time, as Grete said, of great uncertainty in our relations, between Russia and the West. We have, looking at it now from a European perspective, a return to the ambiguities of Russian conduct, which we witnessed during the Cold War, and we see the situation in the Crimea and the Sea of Azov right now as an example of this. But what we also have, which we did not have in the Cold War period, is a kind of parallel incoherence or ambiguity on the Western side, because in the Cold War period, we were used to a certain structure of policy making and strategy on the Western side, in which inevitably the United States was the pivotal power by virtue of its size and its wealth and its military strength. And we now have a situation where this is no longer the case with President Trump as president, because we have a president who, at the rhetorical level at least, is extremely bizarre in what he's saying. And just to give an example of this, and we have to avoid assuming that Trump's statements are in some sense routine. If they're repeated enough, they seem to be routine, but they're not. So that after President Trump went to Paris to celebrate the end of the Great War, a pivotal event in European and French history, instead of sending a message of celebration and friendship to President Macron after the event, he sends a message which refers to the darkest moment of French history, which was the occupation of Paris by the German army. So we're in very, very, very strange and unpredictable territory here. And of course, we're in a situation where Europe itself is facing enormous stress. It's facing it from Brexit, my country, a sort of suicidal policy. We have the growth of authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary. We have the strength of the extreme right in Italy, and we have this strange populist eruption in Paris, les gilets jaunes, which seems to have come out of nowhere. So there is great uncertainty on the European side. And so, in a way, this uncertainty provides a backstop or a background to our conference. But I'm confident that we have the participants from Russia, Europe, and the United States who will make sense of this. So I want to welcome everybody here. I want to welcome our participants, and I look forward, I think, to a very memorable event. Thank you.
Good morning, and thanks to all of you for being here. My name is Maria Stepanova, and I'm editing the Russian website Culture.ru. And it's a meaningful thing that in these times of uncertainty, a Russian website had been invited to join the upcoming conference as a partner. It's a privilege and an honor, and it means a lot. It was and it is a pleasure to cooperate with Fritt Ord and New York Review Books, and I hope that maybe together we'll be able to create a multidimensional picture of contemporary Russia. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll also have a chance to pay attention to another Russia, Russia that is not completely described by the title of our conference, because besides the Russia under Putin, there is a different one, and it seems important to remember it because it doesn't get enough attention in the media right now. That other Russia is still immune to the set of values promoted by the Russian official propaganda. It is ignoring the so-called power vertical and is creating a horizontal structure of everyday solidarity. So we still have alternatives to the mainstream art, to the state propagandist media and to the political doctrine of the late Putinism. That's why this conference is so important for me. And it is even more important that the participants of the conference, the thinkers, the journalists, the producers, film directors, poets, are giving all of us a chance to see this other Russia, Russia without Putin, and to hope that a future for it is still existing. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Gro Holm. I'm a journalist in the foreign news, on the foreign news desk in Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. I'm also a former correspondent to Moscow and to the US, as well as a political scientist in the Soviet Union, in the then Soviet Union in the 80s. I have the honor to start or to be the second in this conference after the sponsors of the conference, and I'm going to lead a panel with two distinguished guests. It's Maxim Trudolyubov. Please, can you take a seat here? And William Taubman. Just a few words about these two panelists. Maxim Trudolyubov, he is an editor-at-large of the daily business paper, Vedomosti. He is also a senior fellow at the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., where he has a blog about Russia. He's a contributor to the New York Times and an author of a book that was released this year, The Tragedy of Property, Private Life and Ownership in the Russian State. I can recommend that book. William Taubman, he is a professor of political science at Amherst College in Massachusetts in the US. And he's an author of two very important biographies, political biographies, one about Khrushchev, the man and his area, and one about Gorbachev, his life and times. So please welcome the panelists. The format of this first session is that the panelists, they will have 20 minutes of introduction each. And if they stay very disciplined, there will be some room for questions. I have prepared some questions, and possibly we will also open for questions from the audience. So I just have one question before I give the floor to you. And I have prepared you. Because we are going to talk about Putin, about power in the Kremlin. We still stick with the power that is there. We know he's there. And what is his power base? What is his interaction with the business community? How are decisions taken in the Kremlin nowadays? Many people wonder about that. And I will start with what happened last Sunday. The Russian decision to take a rest in 3 Ukrainian naval vessels just around the Crimea Peninsula. They were on the way into the Azov Sea, and Russia decided to arrest both the vessels and the sailors. And I'm not going to go deeper into that, but just how was that decision taken in the Kremlin? What did Putin know? What can you say about that? I think I will give the word first to Trudolyubov, since you are from the country we are talking about.
Not sure it's working. Hello, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Good morning. Thank you, first of all, for having me, and thank you for organizing this event. Hopefully we'll get to know each other better and understand Russia better and see the other side of Russia too, sort of the different Russia that we are part of So the story, actually the unfolding story of Russia and Ukraine, and this episode of last week, and actually the continuing story, is a good illustration of what Russia does and how the Kremlin operates, in a sense, because it kind of provides us with all the clues that we can. With which we can illustrate the policies. You see, the issue there is that there is a legal situation and a de jure situation, a de facto situation. Crimea is illegally annexed by Russia. Russia considers it part of its territory. Ukraine, of course, does not recognize that as and no other country in the world recognizes that. So when a Ukrainian ship passes through the Strait of Kerch, it is kind of in a legal limbo in a way, in the sense that there is, I mean, from the international point of view, there's no limbo. It's Ukraine's right to do whatever it wants there. But there is Russia that says that this is our territory. And before that, I mean, the technical thing is that actually there is a procedure, kind of a technical procedure between the two militaries to cross the thing. But apparently the Ukrainian side kind of changed the procedure slightly. It just went on, which was essentially, it was not a big deal, apparently. We don't know much about it. It's just that we kind of gather the details here and there. But Russia decided to make a fuss out of it and say loudly that we want to, we own this.
Was Putin involved in any way, do you think?
Of course. I mean,
he knew about it?
Of course. I mean,
okay.
I would.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there, and then we can come back to it. Please, Tom, what's your thinking about it?
Well, actually, I know much less about this than Maxim, so I think I will save my view of the current situation in Ukraine and Russia till later.
Okay, that's okay. So, we leave Ukraine for now, and please, I will give the floor first to you, Maxim, since we're talking about your homeland. Please, the floor is yours. Do you want to sit, or do you want to come here?
Whichever is more comfortable or more. I mean, okay, I can go there. So, this is working. Okay. Oops. So, well, basically, for convenience sake, building on what we've just seen. With Russia and Ukraine, just as a recent example of how it works, we see that Russia's this is a classic example of power play and the kind of politics that Moscow has been into for years, and if we think, well, actually for centuries, but. What is there is basically it's on the part of Russia is creating a kind of a legal black hole, a situation which is viewed differently from Russia's side and from everyone else's side. And Russia has got a long list of territories and situations where almost everyone thinks that Russia is wrong, and Russia thinks that Russia is right. And it would include, I don't know, Transnistria, Abkhazia, Georgia, and like many, obviously Ukraine. Lots of cases, and this is one of them. And Russia is, but basically Russia now is in a tricky situation because I will make a few points that kind of would I would try to describe the kind of the pattern, the general characteristics of Russia's policy and Russia's behavior. One of the fundamental reasons for this kind of behavior is that Russia is both weak, but also very aspirational, and has kind of big ideas about itself as a country and as a force in the world. Russia is weak economically, and if you look at Russia's economy, you wouldn't think that Russia even should be in these kinds of conflicts, because Russia's economy is roughly the size of Texas. Russia's economy is about 3 to 4 times larger than Norway's. And think of the size of the country and the population, which is like Russia is times bigger. And of course the GDP per capita in Russia is like really like times and times less than probably, I think, 1/6 of Norway's and 1/5 of America's, US. So Russia is, and Russia is weak by many other counts, including the military. But then Russia has aspirations. Russia has a mission. And it's been like this for ages, actually. So there's always this gap between Russia's thinking about itself and Russia's ability, Russia's actual power. So Russia would always, it's like almost always, Russia would have to punch above its weight. And there's been, and we can discuss later on, it's kind of a philosophical issue, whether, I mean, what do you do with this? I mean, do you just have to think less about yourself and, cut, down to size, etc., etc.? But, this is the reality. This is how it works. This is Russia's political thinking that somehow forms in the Kremlin. And it produces these end results. With one of them, just here we see as a kind of almost a perfect example, this skirmish with Ukraine, the continuing kind of conflict within the conflict, and Russia has. So this is the explaining part. This is, I think, gives an idea of how it works. So the second big question, I think, is why this kind of attitude that produces these results. So the attitude of this over-ambition in the Kremlin. How we end up, Russia, almost always end up getting this kind of politicians at the top of the Kremlin who produce some kind of version of this, an over-ambition and a lack of ability. And quite frankly, I don't really see a good answer to that. I would just point out that Russia has a peculiar role and position in the world that cannot be changed. It's with physical place, its physical geography, and its cultural space that is always in between. Russia, if you look at culture from the point of view of arts and sciences, Russia is Europe. Russia has, Russia's literature, part of European literature, etc., theater, cinema. But if you look at the other culture, the culture of values, the culture of traditions, the culture of norms and laws, this culture is different. It's like markedly different. And apparently somewhere there are the reasons why the leaders who try to change this, try to navigate this physical position that Russia is in, that it cannot be changed, try to navigate it and try to kind of work with Russia and try to put it within the sort of family of nations, the European home, the Gorbachev's vision of our common home of Europe that was with which he came up in the late 80s. But these leaders, they do appear from time to time in Russia's history, but they tend to their terms tend to be short-lived, and somehow Russia is back to being to being ruled by the kind of elites that continue this centuries-old game of weakness and ambition, and trying to punch above its own weight, and trying to use the kind of play the game from the standpoint of the weak. What do? If you're weak, you try to provoke, you dare, you cause problems, and Russia has enough, almost always has enough of the force, of the strength, to project strength and to produce enough of credible threat to be believed. Russia almost never is the strongest, but it kind of has power to, to project strength, and has always been using this. But now, and I will wrap up, this big kind of view by essentially saying that right now I think that this old game is in crisis, I believe, and it's opposed from two kind of sides, from two directions. From within Russia, we have a growing, hopefully, disconnect and kind of mistrust from the large swaths of population towards the Kremlin politics, the business as usual kind of politics that the Kremlin been doing in Russia for the past at least 20 years, actually longer. But under Putin, there was a certain pattern. We can go into this, but further on. But basically, it's like a very, very, very recognizable pattern. And now we see that beyond Moscow, essentially, like many places in Russia, where we see that this kind of political machine inside domestic Russia is kind of malfunctioning. It's not working well. But on the other hand, is this now with Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, the play is reversed in a way, because Russia has always been played, and certainly has under Putin for the past years, has played the card of the weak by provoking, by daring, by doing things that nobody expects, and producing enough credible threat to be recognized, to try and establish the kind of all these de facto realities on the ground, as it were, that the Kremlin is expert at creating. Again, Transnistria, in Georgia, in Ukraine, etc. So this is the game of a weak player who uses its potential to the full, trying to play the game, trying to punch above its weight. But now with Ukraine, it's reversed, in the sense that Ukraine is the weak. Russia is militarily, Russia is way stronger, and Russia has a navy. Ukraine almost has no navy. In this particular situation, Ukraine is not a military player, really. But Ukraine is playing the game of the weak in this particular situation because Ukraine is in the right. Ukraine is legally, it's like everything, the international law is behind Ukraine. And international support is behind Ukraine. So the issue is whether international leaders and the international system is strong enough. Is there something called the West anymore? Is there a reality that that can be relied upon from Ukraine's standpoint to cover and to project strength in Ukraine's favor in this conflict? Russia is doing its own game, continues to do it, basically creating a de facto reality on the ground, calling it reality. It's my territory. The Kremlin says, I own it. Deal with it. And the idea is, and like everybody, and then the Kremlin looks at the space and the international crowd and says, so okay, who's going to challenge that? And I mean, you be the judge, right? Who's going to challenge that? And Ukraine is now playing the same thing vis-a-vis Russia, being the weak. And Ukraine cannot do any other because obviously of the disparity. But this is where we are. So Russia's usual game is there. I've tried to describe it. We'll see how it works out, and we'll see how the international order, to what extent it's still able to support international order, legal foundations for coexistence and cooperation between nations. Yeah, I've finished on that.
Yep, thank you so much.
Good morning. Dobre utro. Unfortunately, I don't know how to say it in Norwegian, but I should be able to learn. That doesn't sound too hard. For my purposes this morning, I want to take a step back and talk more broadly and follow up on Simon's mandate to me. He asked me to talk about how Putinism does and does not resemble its Soviet predecessor. Well, how to do that? I think the first point I want to make, and I will elaborate on it as I go along, is that its Soviet predecessor evolved and changed. And one has to distinguish between Stalinism and late Soviet regime. Now, here is my approach. It's two parts. I want to discuss two different types of regimes, two regime types, totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and to argue that the Soviet regime, obviously in its Stalinist incarnation, was a totalitarian regime, but that the late Soviet regime was, well, quasi-totalitarian, post-totalitarian, obviously very different from what Stalin had been, and that the Putin regime is authoritarian rather than totalitarian, although I know this view is not universally accepted. And Masha Gessen, for example, is somebody who argues in her new book, The Future as History, that Putin's Russia is returning to totalitarianism. That's the first part of my remarks. And the second is I want to compare the Soviet predecessor and Putin's regime across a series of categories, both domestic and foreign. And my conclusion when I do this is, to put it briefly, less is more. What I mean by that is that Putinism in many ways is stronger and appears to be potentially more enduring than at least the late Soviet regime, because it is authoritarian rather than totalitarian or totalitarianism in decline. I suspect there will be people who want to argue with me about all of this, and that would be fine. Okay, totalitarianism. I look back at definitions of totalitarianism, and one of them, in its most pure form by Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, goes like this. It has the following features. First of all, it includes an official ideology to which all are supposed to adhere, at least passively, and that ideology also is a theoretical guide to the regime's efforts to create a new world. Second, it includes a single mass party directing and controlling society under the direction of a single leader. Third and fourth, totalitarianism involves a technologically conditioned, that is, relying on technology to monopolize arms combat and to monopolize mass communications. And thirdly, totalitarianism in its pure form involves terroristic police control, not only versus real, but also versus imaginary enemies of the regime, with arbitrarily as well as predictably selected victims. Arbitrarily, that becomes very important. Well, having said this, you can see that without much argument at all, this fits Stalinist Russia, Soviet Union. But does it fit the late Soviet regime? Not exactly. The ideology, the first item, did exist, of course, but as Solzhenitsyn once argued, that ideology was actually dead, in the sense that very few people actually believed in it. And yet, even though it was dead, it continued to guide the hand of the regime for the simple reason that people had to pretend that they believed in it, even though they actually did not. Single mass party, the second characteristic of totalitarianism. Yes, there was a single mass party, the Communist Party, but by the end, it was not only coming apart in the sense that many people disbelieved in its ideology, but it was also riven by factions, many of which were not visible to the outside world, but they were there. Did it continue to monopolize the means of armed combat? Yes, it did. Did it continue to monopolize mass media? Yes, it did, although there were dissidents and there was samizdat. And what about terror? Well, it was much less, of course, than it had been under Stalin. And it was no longer arbitrary in the sense that anybody could be denounced and picked up in the middle of the night and sent away. Authoritarianism. How does authoritarianism differ from totalitarianism? Well, for one thing, it lacks that highly developed mobilizing ideology in which people have to seem to believe, and which is, whether dead or alive, a guide to the building of a new world. Secondly, it tolerates greater social pluralism and even some political pluralism, but not much. Thirdly, the police powers are much more selectively applied, not arbitrarily or in the mass scale that they once were. And finally, an authoritarian regime, as I'm defining it, is less intent on mobilizing the populace to pursue the overall goals of creating a new society. Well, my argument would be that Putin's regime is authoritarian, as I've defined it, rather than totalitarian, as I've defined that. You may want to argue that this is semantic and that a different definition would produce a different conclusion, but for purposes of argument, that's the way I want to put it forward. Now, let me elaborate on this by doing the second part of what I said I would do, which is to compare the late Soviet regime and Putin's regime under a series of categories, first domestic and then foreign. The first category has to do with the degree of control by the party/state over society. As I said already, the late Soviet regime was less dominating than its Stalinist predecessor, but I think it was more dominating than Putin's regime. And here I will be very interested to hear the opinion of our Russian participants. But as I look at it, what do I see? I see at least one newspaper, Novaya Gazeta, at least one radio station, Echo Moskvy. I see greater freedom to travel, witness the fact that so many of you are here and are going to be speaking your mind. I see or I hear all of the pluralism that's available on the internet. And what this seems to add up to is what I summarized at the beginning by saying less is more. That is, by the end of the Soviet period, still to the extent that the party state did dominate the regime, that had become a kind of liability, producing resentment and anger about the regime itself in some circles. And I guess what I would say, hoping that there'll be challenge and response to it, is that to the degree that Putinism allows these safety valves that I described, it strengthens itself as compared to the late Soviet regime. So that was the first category that I'm comparing. Ideology. The Soviet regime's ideology, as we all know, was Marxism, Leninism / Stalinism, as long as he was around, and to some extent even after he was gone. Is there an ideology under Putinism? Well, there is nationalism, there is statism, there is religion. Whether it adds up to an ideology, I'm not sure. But it's different also in the sense that it has deeper roots, as Maxim implied, in Russian values and Russian tradition. Deeper roots than Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. So in that sense too, in reverting to the norm, the Russian norm, as Putin has done, he has given himself and his regime, strengthened himself and his regime as compared to the late Soviet period. Third category, the economy. The Soviet regime, the late Soviet regime, its over-centralization stifled the economy, slowed economic growth, created a disaster in agriculture. Under Putin, the state still looms large. It picks some of the major owners, creates its own oligarchs, controls much of the economy. But still, I think, and here too you may want to argue, that it is the Russian economy is freer than the old Soviet economy was to reflect some of the realities of supply and demand. And in agriculture, I was stunned to read in a recent issue of The Economist this sentence. In 2016, Russia became the world's largest wheat exporter. What a striking contrast to the tens of millions of tons of wheat that the late Soviet regime had to buy with scarce hard currency in the West. So again, whatever else one may say about Putin's Russia economy, it has certain strengths that the late Soviet economy did not. Technology. Well, the classic conventional wisdom about technology under the Soviet regime was that it lagged, except in certain selected areas like the military. And it lagged because of excessive centralization and secrecy, which prevented Soviet scientists from talking sometimes even to each other, let alone to Westerners in their own field. I don't know as much as I'd like to about the state of technology in Putin's Russia, and perhaps some other participants will speak about this. But certainly as an American who has to hear every other day about the exploits of Russian technology in affecting our elections and hacking into our various networks, it sounds as if, at least in that area, it's doing pretty well and perhaps better than the old Soviet technology. One other category for comparison, succession, political succession. If you think back over the whole Soviet period, you will remember that when Lenin died and Stalin died and Khrushchev was ousted, every time they had to pick a successor to the previous existing leader, there was instability, at times unrest, danger to the regime. I think the issue of a succession in Putin's Russia, well, it hasn't been tested yet unless you want to think of Medvedev as a temporary successor. If you do, then you have to again see Putin's strength, because think of it, he picked somebody to succeed him who, as we all know, when the time came, gratefully left the stage. You think about the Soviets, they thought Stalin was a gray clerk, turned out not to be. Khrushchev appeared to be the least of the competitors to succeed Stalin, turned out he won the battle. Khrushchev didn't see Brezhnev, he thought Brezhnev as his number two would be weak. Brezhnev, in effect, ousted him. Gorbachev surprised all the people who picked him to succeed Chernenko. So the Soviets over and over again sort of made a choice that ended up surprising them or disturbing them or wounding them, as many of them saw it. But Putin, so far so good, but the big problem will come when Putin dies or otherwise disappears and has to be succeeded. And here, I'm not so sure that the advantage goes to the Putinist system, because at least the Soviet system had hierarchy, which allowed an identified group of people on top to pick their successor, even if they did it wrongly, whereas if Putin goes, who picks his successor? Not clear, possibly a potential danger for the regime. Finally, two areas of foreign policy, and then one final comparison. First issue, relations with the West. Well, there was once a Cold War, and now there appears to be a new Cold War. And I'm not going to talk exactly about how the old Cold War and the new Cold War differed, but rather focus on the attitude or relations with the West. It strikes me that in the case of the Soviet regime, the constant anti-Western propaganda in the end boomeranged. That is, many citizens of the Soviet Union ended up becoming pro-Western, in part because the regime was so anti-Western. They wanted the opposite. They idealized, it appears, what the West could be for them and do for them. Compare that to, at least my sense, that anti-Westernism and anti-Americanism, although again other participants may know better, is now more sincere and genuine among Russians than anti-Westernism used to be under the Soviet Union. And to the extent that that's true, that is another comparison that strengthens the Putin regime. What about the overextendedness, the possible overextendedness of the Soviet Empire versus the Russian attempt to spread its influence in the world? Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, of course, which turned out to be, as it might have well have been predicted, a kind of eventual trap. And Afghanistan, the classic example of overextension of the Soviet Empire. Now compare that to, say, the Russian intervention in Syria, so far surprisingly extensive, but apparently limited as compared to Afghanistan. And compare Putin's effort to, if not annex and control, at least dominate to a surprising extent what the Russians call the near abroad, the former Soviet republics. So far, seemingly more constrained, limited, and perhaps therefore in the long run more enduring. Finally, an issue that I don't quite know how to handle when it comes to comparison, but think of it, I could call it leadership itself, leaders and their personalities. Take the 5 Soviet leaders, the main Soviet leaders, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, I'm leaving out Andropov and Chernenko. 4 of them, I think about 4 of them, it can be said that they had an absolutely decisive influence on the direction of their country, and that furthermore, that influence can be traced back, if you attempt to be a biographer, as I have in the case of Khrushchev and Gorbachev, to their character. Without Lenin, you basically don't get a seizure of power in October 1917 because all of his comrades were reluctant to actually seize power. Without Stalin, you get collectivization, you get a cruel, brutal regime, but I don't think you get the terror on the scale in which it eventually occurred, because that, I think, goes back in large part to his personal paranoia. Without Khrushchev, you don't get the denunciation of Stalin in 1956, and you don't get the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, because in ways that I try to describe in my biography of Khrushchev, that reflected his character. And without Gorbachev, you don't get the transformation of Soviet communism and indeed its collapse in the form that it took. In other words, the only leader of those 5 who acts as others leaders would have in his place, if they had been in his place, is Brezhnev. Now, what about Putin? As I think about Putin, what Putin's basic course at home and abroad is pretty much what other leaders in his circle would have done in his place. It's a reversion to the Russian norm after, as Maxim said, the exceptional, miraculous behavior of Gorbachev. Now, maybe you want to say that Putin, the skill with which he has carried out this policy, the brazenness of it, the brutality, is unique. But the basic course, I think, is what others would have done in his place. So in thinking about the comparison between Soviet predecessor and Putin's regime, I ask myself, what was it about the Soviet regime that produced 4 of its 5 major leaders acting in this extraordinary way, as opposed to, well, 1, Putin, that's not much of a sample, not much of a sample when it comes to post-Soviet leaders, although we do have Yeltsin. I'm leaving him out of it for the moment. What was it about the Soviet regime that produced that, and is there anything like that under current circumstances? And I don't have a good answer for that, except to say that the very power that the Soviet regime vested in its leader, and the very ideology which accustoms its leaders to feeling that they had to take decisive action to create a new world, helps to explain why this pattern. Well, those are the comparisons I wanted to make, and I tried to indicate at the beginning what I think it adds up to, and so I will pick up my papers and stop here. Thank you. Hello.
While we are fixing the, do your microphones work?
Hello. This is working.
Okay. Okay, at least we have one working. So, thank you so much for very, very interesting introductions. And I think I will just have one question for each of you before I open up for the audience to ask questions. And I think I will start where you finished, the question about character. Because, and the question is, Russia is on paper, in many ways, a democracy. It has democratic institutions, bicameral parliament, it has courts around the country, it has elections, it has also governor elections. Before, governor was appointed for a brief period, now they are again elected, not appointed by the president. So, if you had a character that was different from Putin, that was like Medvedev or even more liberal, could you have a country that was democratic in its essence, not authoritarian as you described? The question is, of course, how decisive is character when you have the institutions in place?
Is this working? Yes, I think it is. Well, this reminds me, of course, the case that all the years, beginning in the 1930s, the Soviet Union had a constitution, which many of the dissidents eventually demanded or tried to demand the regime follow its own constitution. And of course, they did not until the regime collapsed. So the existence on paper, I'm afraid, and even more than paper, as you said, there is a Duma. The existence of these institutions does not guarantee at all that they function the way theoretically they should. And actually asking that question reminds me of another regime type, apart from totalitarianism and authoritarianism, which is sometimes used to characterize the Putin regime, and that is illiberal democracy, in which you have a democratically elected regime which proceeds to limit or even eliminate the actual liberties of its citizens. The trouble with that, one might say, is that Putin's elections that chose him were not fully fair and free. But even if they were not, the public opinion polling shows that he has been, until recently, wildly popular. So I guess the short answer is the existence of these institutions could be helpful when the change comes, but are unlikely to produce the change in and of themselves.
Okay. What do you think, Maxim? If you had a democratically minded person, a true Democrat by intention, by mind?
This person has to get there first. And this is the tricky part, because you see, the elections, they look like elections, but they're, and I mean, if you monitor them, again, the trick is, if you monitor the elections in Russia, at the actual stage of the actual ballot, you will probably call it free and fair. If you were an alien, you could just, parachuted into this and just see the actual procedure, you would say, fine, it's a fine procedure. But it's not, in actual fact, because most of it, not most, anyone who could challenge the incumbent are removed at the earliest stages possible. So they're like in the bud, they've just extinguished, like they don't even let to show, this first signs of, life. And this is, and the Kremlin is extremely efficient at this. So whenever you have an election, including the Putin election, but the regional election, Russia has numerous, dozens and dozens of elections each and every year, every September. Just recently, we had a new round. And you have always the same thing happening when you have a person essentially appointed. Now it's actually complicated, but just to simplify the story, in a way it's a meritocracy. The Kremlin is building a meritocracy in a way, just to be fair. I'm not just saying that the Kremlin is like all bad. The Kremlin also has positive ideas, by the way. So they try to create a meritocracy. So they kind of educate these people. They train them, then they parachute them into this particular region, and then they conduct an election almost as a special operation. So that everyone goes and votes for the right guy or woman, man, usually a man. And actually younger, like better probably, but it's still not a real election. So that's the point. So basically it's hard to get there through this. You cannot really get there. So you can only get there through some kind of crisis.
Okay. I have one more question for you, Maxim. We want to understand how this power system is functioning. How is Kremlin functioning? It's foggy for most people, I think. There was a former counselor of 3 presidents, Gleb Pavlovsky. He wrote an article in a journal, American journal called Foreign Affairs, in 2016, where he wrote that Putin never really reveals his goals, not even internally, even to his close advisors. The decision-making process takes form of a contest among groups who want to prove their loyalty, who are enforcers who really put Putin's, what they believe are Putin's intentions into practical politics. To what extent is that a correct description, do you think?
Well, it's really hard to tell. I mean, Gleb Pavlovsky should know because he was part of this system, very closely worked with it for years and years. So probably it does ring true, but it's essentially the honest, like really honest answer would be it's a black box. We really don't know. I mean, issues like Crimea, take Crimea, it's like an overwhelmingly important decision. It changed nearly everything for Russia in the short term, and it will be there forever as a long-term issue. And we don't know how the decision was taken. We've just heard that I don't know, the finance probably even the foreign minister was not part of the actual decision-making process. Probably, we don't know. But
so who of the Siloviki was involved then?
Well, probably a group of the of those security experts around Putin. Probably again, there's no. I mean, we just we have rumors. We have all kinds of tales, anecdotes, and jokes, but we don't really have because this is. I mean, being a black box is power. This is how it works. I mean, if Putin cannot relinquish that, and just say, "Okay, I'll go transparent right now," and then I mean he's gone. And this is the whole point. So, yeah.
Just a quick, again, Soviet comparison. I'm thinking back to what we now know, but did not know then about the decision to intervene in Afghanistan. The whole Politburo was not involved. It was just Ustinov, Gromyko, Andropov, and Brezhnev to the extent he was still compos mentis.
Yeah. You keep the microphone. Okay. Thank you. I think I will now open for a question or two. So can you please tell who you are and...
Irina Prokhorova, New Literary Observer, Russia. Thank you for, I want to thank both participants for valuable talk. But my question is to Professor Taubman. Please, my question...
Hear that well, so
yes.
you have to repeat it for me.
Yeah, the question to Professor Taubman. My question is very simple. Why have you skipped Yeltsin altogether from your talk? I think he is one of the major figures for Russian democracy. Somehow, it's a little bit strange. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that's a good question. I plead guilty. How could I forget Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin? I guess because I was focused on the comparison between Soviet predecessors and Putin regime. He certainly was a decisive figure. Actually, I think in some ways, although I have not written his biography, he probably fits Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Gorbachev. He was so distinctive, decisive, peculiar in many ways. But you're right, I take your point.
Okay, then there's the man up in, yeah.
I think my voice is loud enough. My name is Dyson. I'm involved in business in Russia and oil and gas. And I'm also a South African, which is also going through the same types of trauma as a relatively new country as Russia is, in terms of corruption, in terms of the guys at the top stealing as much as they can, while the people are still trying to figure out their democratic power. And I just wanted to remind you of a comment of Ralph Nader, who said that the real power in the United States, which of course is the arch capitalist country of the world, are the 60,000 lobbyists in Washington, D.C. I think Trump would very much like it if he could run the country with all these lobbyists and the businessmen, and the democratic structures could just step aside. My point is this. You cannot understand Putin's Russia and the power in the Kremlin unless you understand the culture of decision-making, the culture of management, and what's going on in the Rosneft, Gazprom, and the other companies that are operating. And there is a certain degree of transparency. And it is there that academics should be looking to see how these decisions are made and the source, part of the source of Putin's power. I'm finished in a second. Russia is a new capitalist country. And Russia is going through stages now which the United States went through at the beginning of the 20th century, which the United States is still going through, where big capital still makes a lot of the decisions that eventually get passed in Washington. So I would really like to hear the panelists' comments on the idea that Putin's power is also dependent upon the behavior of uncontrolled players in a new capitalist environment.
Thank you for raising that question. It was on my list, but I didn't get there. Putin promised to get away with the oligarchs, but he didn't. And you got this society, this interaction he described. What do you think?
But he did in his own way. I'll try to explain it. You see, I would question Russia's capitalism first. What kind of capitalism has 75% of the nation's economy run or owned by the state? We don't know. Actually, the figure is probably more than that because we don't have a good figure. We have an old figure from 2014 by the International Monetary Fund, and they produced this figure, 75%. Also, there is a Russian Ministry for Antitrust Agency that also gives a similar assessment. But it's hard to judge because we don't know who actually owns what. Because Russia's system of property is not the system of property that you all know. It's essentially hierarchical. And the ultimate owner is the Kremlin, the people who run the Kremlin. And people who own things, they do own them in a way, but they don't really own them in totality, in their entirety. They depending on where they are on this ladder of interests, they can do more or less with their assets, but they not. Which is like true, they don't really fully control them. And this is how he he changed the oligarchic system in a way that he essentially made oligarchs into his servants in the way that almost remarkably resembles, I don't know, 16th century, 17th century relationships that the Tsars would have with the largest, strongest groups within the aristocracy and the landowners. So the head of state, the Tsar in the old, and now the head of the political system essentially behaves like an ultimate proprietor of these assets. It just differs from stage to stage. I mean, if you do own an apartment, almost fully, except that in Moscow sometimes you could get it, taken from you. But if it's an oil company, you don't really own it. No.
Okay. We have time for one more question. Please make it short and make the answer also short. Because
Anton Weiss, Norwegian Holocaust Center. Two brief questions, one for entire panel, another for Bill Taubman. The first question in terms of definition of authoritarian versus totalitarian, also related to the issue of succession. Mark Fagin, very well-known Russian human rights lawyer, was speaking at the Atlantic Council about a week ago. He said something striking. He said, what I'm witnessing in Russia is now a transition from authoritarian to dictatorial. And there is different signs, the willingness to tweak constitution. I mean, the government has all the legal means at their disposal, but basically the idea is Putin will remain in power. Do you agree with Mark Fagin or not? And the question for Bill Taubman, talking about the ideology of its element, nationalism, Russian orthodoxy, or statism, don't you think that the foundational myth of Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, it was foundational myth first of the Soviet Union, now of Russia, has entered already basically, it is very basic on the level of ideology, and whether it has to do with domestic politics or international politics, particularly with the so-called near abroad. Thank you.
Okay. Small questions. Yeah, really simple. Who wants to start?
Well, as best I understood you, and the problem is my hearing, not your voice. Yes, of course, the nationalist strain, especially during World War II and afterwards, almost came to overshadow the Marxist-Leninist elements of ideology. But isn't it interesting how that particular role of World War II and its glorification of the Soviet victory in World War II is a theme of continuity which Putin has picked up, that Stalin, in fact, began and continued even after Stalin in the post-Stalin period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, can you please remind me the question, because I was daydreaming.
The question is, are we witnessing transition from authoritarian form of rule to dictatorial? That's what Mark Fagin was saying. Do you agree with him or not?
I think it's, you can argue about notions, and political scientists mostly place Russia somewhere, depending on where you look, and there are all those, regime types. Russia is a liberal democracy. If you like the hybrid regime terminology, not all political scientists accept that, so it could be hybrid regime. It doesn't really, authoritarian is a classic, so most political scientists actually, if you take Polity 4, there's this commonly used scale of regimes. Russia is an authoritarian regime. Dictatorial, I think, is more like a historic term. You can go into history and compare Putin to, I don't know, Augustus, the Roman emperor, and think, to what extent Putin, he probably would actually favorably compare to that. So, so I think it's a kind of an argument. It's an interesting one, but I would just say that Russia is an authoritarian regime, and the interesting part is how it works and what to do about it.
Okay. Our time is out. Thank you to the panelists. We will certainly continue discussions in the breaks and during the day. Thank you, and I think a big hand.